Welcome to Mysteries of Writing, where various topics about writing is taken into deeper perspective. Today, I'm going to tell you a story of how I started writing. So, writing's always been a part of my life since I could pick up a pencil. And going to school, you're expected to know how to write something through each grade level. But the first time that I felt like writing was really fun and very engaging was in third grade whenever we had our writer's notebook and we could write little short stories based on little writing prompts. And that was really fun. And I was really looking forward to every time we were allowed to go in our journals and just write something that was in our minds and we can just make it all up. And no one could judge that. And it also came to me throughout middle school as I had some class assignments writing poems and skits. And there was a time that we also wrote a fiction story. Like never finished it though, but I wish that I retrieved it. Have you ever loved doing something that you wanted to keep doing? Something that you can't just get your mind off of. Something that keeps you going. And writing really came back to me my freshman year in my English 1 class. We were doing plenty of writing assignments and it was really fun, really fun. But it was whenever I was at my lowest, which was whenever I tore my ACL in December of 2021 during basketball practice. And that was something that took me off course. I even played through the injury till I just couldn't. And as the days till the surgery came, I questioned to myself, what could I do if I wasn't able to play basketball? I thought about that for a while, and the answer came to me: writing. And eventually, the idea of writing a book came to me, and that's when I finally wanted to I want to write a book. And my first book, I'll just call it MM for short. I made sure that I dedicated at least once a week. So I went downstairs to my parents' office. I added a Google Doc on Google Drive, started writing a prologue. And then what was so funny, like as I was like writing this down, I was like, have you imagined seeing the story in on the big screen inside your head? That's how I felt. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit because MM goes way back, and it all started in the dream around 3 in the morning, like December 2020. And I was thinking of this story as a movie in my head, and I thought it was the greatest idea in the world. Now I think of it as like a flop, but I love the story so much, or at least the idea of it, that I decided to write a script. So I had my journal that I kept since middle school, had some available blank pages, and I just wrote it down. I wrote it down. And I didn't stop until I finished it. And fun fact, it took me a month and a half to do so. And that was really fun to me. That was really fun. And whenever I was able to write that first book, yes, I heavily relied on that script that I wrote in my journal to write the first book. And it was like my outline. So it was going really well. I was, you know, spending once or twice a week on it, just typing on the computer and la da da da. It was a great story. Great. Until I hit the battle scene. And when I confronted the battle scene, I was like, what is a battle scene? Well, I know what a battle scene is. I've seen so many battle scenes in movies, but how do I write a battle scene? And I had to stop writing completely because I couldn't write it out. I couldn't get through the story until I get this battle scene down. And I was afraid I was not going to be able to finish the book. My first one, which was crazy. And I had to step aside. I had to do something else. I had to research what it meant to write an effective battle scene. And I learned so many things from that I was like, there's no correct way to write something. And whenever I went back to writing, I was able to write the battle scene the best way I could and just focus on the characters because that's who's in there and they're the ones facing whatever's at stake. So I thought about less about the battle being perfect and make it as messy as possible because battles are meant to be messy. So when you start writing, you're going to feel confident and assume that you're bulletproof. Well, that's not necessarily the case because we all go through it. You might have fought the battle, but you haven't faced the war. What I mean about that is the war is the process. If you can't handle the small things in writing, how are you going to face the bigger things that might seem more challenging and seem like that you might not get through it? So, my early writing mistakes. I have plenty of them. But I'll say one of the earliest ones I had was I went straight into editing the first book instead of going to the sequel. So when I finished it in the end of March of 2022, I was I was so excited, happy. I feel very accomplished of finishing the first book. But then in April, I was like, you know what? I'll get this a really nice read, and if I don't like certain parts, I'll go back and edit. And that's exactly what I did. I read it. I was like, I don't like a few things, so I went back in the writer's chair and took away some things that I didn't like. And I kept on doing that kind of, and I was like, why am I doing this? Like, of course it's messy and all that stuff because it's obviously the first draft, but should I get back to the story that I've kind of left to the side? And that was the sequel. But before I get to the sequel, because the sequel was actually the second mistake I made. Because while I was writing the first book, I was writing the second book, which was the sequel. And I was multitasking with it. And fun fact that I had a script version of the second book. Convenient, right? Well, not entirely. Because the second book distracted me from finishing the first book. I was like, okay, let's see. If I can write the first book, okay, easy peasy, lemmy squeezy, I can do the second book. Maybe it wouldn't take me as long, and I could get pieces together and fix it all later. But little did I know that it was a disaster. So I had to put the second book aside and put my attention to the first one. But as soon as I finished the first one, I got I got into the second book in April. So you're going to have ideas that are going to spit like fire. But if you cannot maintain it, you might lead yourself out of control. So it's good to write additional ideas on the side to remember it and something to go back to if you're stuck writing the story you're currently working on. And it's okay to have ideas. Just put it on a little sticky note or wherever you store your information. So whenever I wrote the second book, I was about like on chapter 5 in April, and no rush, no rush at all, but I was like, you know what? Ever since like finishing the first book, I think I want to do something different. I think I want to change something. And that thing that I wanted to change was how much I was relying on my script, which was my outline, I guess. And I was like, okay, I got a good idea what the story looks like in my head because it played like a movie. However, what if I can just put it aside, just almost not look at it at all, and write the story? So that's what I did. I allowed the words to come to me and take over the story. And when I did that, I felt like I improved. I felt like I I didn't have to follow a certain structure, or I didn't have to restrict myself in a way that I couldn't express myself through my writing. That, oh wow, I discovered a lot. And I was actually able to write more words than if I just followed with the script and got more into the characters. I got myself into the character shoes and experienced what they were going through and understand who they were. And that right there turned everything around. And I was in the middle of a story and I started writing by hand because I was like, anytime a part of the story would come to me, if I don't have something right there to just write it out, I am most likely going to forget it, or it's not going to come as it first came out to me. So I have to write it out. No wonder I carry a lot of folders just to write something down. And it can come at any time. So, yes, I started to bring a journal so I could write my story at any time whenever it came to me. And that started like at the very end of my freshman year into my sophomore year. So, yes. And I had so much momentum until I reached halfway through chapter 12 whenever I was almost at a balancing. What was so funny was it was the next day of the story, and my mind went completely blank. And I was afraid of not finishing the story. Because if I didn't finish this story, I wasn't going to finish the series. And I was really scared. And there were days, multiple days, that I was not able to write at all because I didn't know what words, like the words were not coming to me in order for me to move on from that scene. And I asked one of my classmates in art just a simple question. If you were thinking about the next day, like what will you write about? I don't know. And even though he didn't know anything about my story, he gave me a good idea of how I could start it. And the words came back to me. And I even wrote on the top of my paper, like, this person helped me write my story. And like, without him like telling me just that little bit that gave me motivation to keep going, I don't think I would have finished the story, not even the rest of the series. I was able to write the rest of the story pretty smoothly, and I was able to finish the second book at the end of my freshman year, and that was amazing. And then I was so excited that that same night, it's funny because it was Monday Night Raw, May 16th, 2022, that I was like, the third book came to me, and I was like, I wrote about halfway of chapter one. I was on a roll, and it was very exciting. And I was like, it felt like all this momentum was coming to me, and I was like, whew, I'm running so smoothly, and nothing's in my way, and da 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 da. And I was like, I have the whole summer. I'm gonna finish the third book by the end of the summer. By the time my sophomore year began, I was at, or almost at chapter 5, which was crazy. And whenever school started, it was a major reason why I wasn't writing as much as I was my freshman year. And I was really struggling to really find the time. And it just felt so irritating. Like, whenever I was like, I had this schoolwork where I could be writing something else, but the schoolwork was such a big deal. Like, I was like, there's no room for failure, that I put my schoolwork over my writing. And I was like, this means I'm putting schoolwork over my storytelling and my potential in writing. And it was a big sacrifice. And I didn't necessarily like it either. But yeah. But what made it worse was that I was editing my first book. So I put the book down for a few months, and when I went back to the first book editing, the reason the thing that I hated the most about the first book was the prologue. The prologue was so unreadable that how how could a reader get to chapter 1 or even the next page? And I was like, I was struggling for days to like, okay, how am I going to write this? How am I going to make it readable enough to that even I can like read it and like feel like I can go to the next page without feeling like I'm going to cringe because of the way it is kind of worded. It's like kind of bumpy or like something's a little inconsistent or whatever. But the prologue just needed a lot to change, and there are certain things like time jumps I had is very unnecessary, and I wish I had done something else. I was like, what was I thinking when I first wrote this prologue? And I had so many questions. Sometimes you would have to give yourself a reset, give yourself a fresh mind to address the elephant in the room. And if you allow yourself to that time, it could open up your understanding and what that thing was that that was so like mind blowing at first. Then you're like, oh, something's wrong with it, and then you fix it, and then it feels satisfying. It's bringing up the next big mistake that I did, which was writing a story while editing, which was a terrible idea. Same year of 2022, and man, it was horrible. I felt like I was story hopping, and what I mean by story hopping is just hopping from one story to another. It was terrible. And I was even editing my first book, which was a bad idea because I couldn't get too far with the third book. Like, I would make very little progress with the third book. And it was terrible. It was really terrible. I couldn't believe myself. Like, why would I do that? Why would I set myself up for like basically failure? And speaking of failure, I even put a deadline on myself. And that deadline was I was going to finish the third book by the end of 2022. Guess what? I didn't meet that deadline. Why? Because I didn't give myself enough time to write the story out. I didn't even see the whole story in my mind. Remember, I had it play as a movie in my head, and I was like out of this world, and I was expected like to come to be like that, but no, because the problem with the third book was every time I imagined it in my head, I couldn't get through the first act, and that was really hard, and I had to take the story at a little bit at a time, and yes, it was slow, but I felt like I was getting some progress, and even at the end of 2022, like maybe okay, I didn't finish it when I wanted to. Maybe I gave myself an unrealistic time frame of whenever I was going to finish it. Maybe this third book was teaching me that sometimes you're not going to get done when you're going to get done or when you want to get done. Sometimes it's going to take a process. Sometimes you have to go into the war to know like what's there. And what's funny is that whenever I was in the middle of chapter 12 on December 28th, 2022, the rest of the story came to me like from a whole other dream. And I got my purple journal out, and I was like, okay, I'm writing I'm outlining it like by like sections, kind of like okay, like just one line. Okay. Next chapter. Okay, and I was finally getting the story, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is the story. But what I had to do, I had to write it. I had to make myself finish it. And what I mean by finish it, I had to drive myself to the end. I had to finish the story. I have to keep going. I can't stop. I can't allow excuses to keep coming to be like, oh, you're not gonna do this. Like, no, the words aren't gonna come to you. No, finish. The third book was really the first time that I experienced writer's block. And at first, it was very uncertain why I was going through this. But I also, when I realized that I had to push through, because writer's block is only an obstacle. It's just that little ticking, that clock has like just trying to tell you time's up and like just stop what you're doing. Of course, writer's block kept on coming to me throughout 2023, and like days and even weeks at a time that I wasn't able to write as much as I wanted to. And it was a lot. However, I kept writing. I allowed the words to come to me, and I just kept writing whatever I could find the time to write. It took me all the way till the last day of school to write the last chapter. So the last day of my sophomore year, I I was basically at the end. I knew the last four words of the story. I was like, I'm almost there, almost there, almost there. Just come on, just one more chapter. And I knew it was coming. I knew that the moment was here, and when I wrote the last four words, it was it was a moment that I could never forget because I had written an entire book series that I never thought I would have done. And yes, there were obstacles that were in my way. Yes, there were times that I didn't have any time to write. Yes, there were people who were like, okay, I see you're doing this, but like, you're gonna make this a real thing and all. And I looked past all that and allowed myself to write, allowed myself to fuel that passion that I had for writing. And then within 1 year and 4 months, I was able to finish the series. And what to take away from that experience is number one, trust the process. You might have fought the battle, but you haven't faced the war. And facing the war, you had to go through it. You can't go around it. You can't go under it. You have to go through it. And the process is not always going short. It can be long. It can span from different time periods. But if you allow yourself to stay the course, you'll see the finish line. Number two, take one thing at a time and don't try to do everything. You might have so many things in your mind that it might be the greatest ideas in the world. But if you just do everything, you're just going to confuse yourself. You're probably not get much done. Whereas if you focus on one thing, work on that, improve it, and make it worth something, get that done, and then get to everything else. And then number three, you are your own professional. You are the best person who knows yourself. You know how you function. So don't let anyone tell you that you are not who you say you are. Allow yourself to be the best version of yourself.